Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the latest edition of QTalks, an online series of conversations all around the future of water powered by KTM. So these 30-minute sessions are designed to be bite-sized, engaging, and digestible, so you can enjoy them live or even over at a coffee break on demand at a later time. So topics that we've addressed in the past, for those of you who have tuned in, will know digital twins through to circular economy, digitalization, investment, and really much, much more. But today, the topic is on water security. So how we can create certainty in uncertain times. My name is Tom Freyberg. I'm an environmental journalist and content creator specializing in water, and I'll be your host for the next 30 minutes. So today we are absolutely thrilled to be joined by an all-star panel. You could say the A-team of water security experts from across Europe and the US. In fact, all of our speakers do have PhDs, so I'm going to have to be on my best form today to keep up. And I think actually all of our speakers bring a unique perspective when it comes to water security. So I'm very pleased to welcome, we have John Matthews, who's the co-founder and executive director for the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation, known as AGWA. We have Martina Klimes, who is the advisor on water and peace at the Stockholm International Water Institute, known as SIWI, S-I-W-I. And last but not least, we have David Kilcullen, who is the CEO of the Cordillera Applications Group. So welcome, John, Martina, and David. And to get going, I think because perhaps the definition of water scarcity perhaps is maybe misunderstood in places, but it is continually changing. I really just want to throw to our speakers to get how they would define it currently and how they see that it's really changed. So, John, let's bring you in first of all on that question, if we can.
Thank you so much, Tom. I'm really great to be in this Q Talk. It's a really important question about how we view water security, how it might be changing as a kind of practical definition that informs our policy and operations. And if you look over the past 25 or 30 years, I think we've seen a gradual shift initially from being very focused on the water sector, how we treat, supply water, how we move water, how the water sector is able to support other sectors, and essentially viewing the future as something that's pretty predictable. This goes, I think, right to the title, that in the maybe 30 years ago, 20 years ago, in some cases even 5 or 10 years ago, many people really had this sense that the future was just going to be a little bit different than we are today. And I think the last 12 years, 14, 15 years has seen a kind of an unraveling of that faith in a predictable and a knowable future. So our sense of how the climate is changing is an obvious one, but there's also been major economic, epidemiological, and political disruptions that have occurred, often starting in one part of the world and then rippling in other places. And there's always a water signature to that. So how is it that we're able to combine in our definition of water security a sense of what is it that is and remains predictable, that remains maybe incrementally different than we see today, versus what is it that we need to be ready for, that we need to be flexible in our orientation. And I think ultimately that also changes how we track and count water security over time. We've often in the past thought that the best indicator is a kind of highly optimized, very efficient use of water, maybe trying to maximize the benefits of water in our infrastructure, in our investments, in our cities. And now we need to say, actually, it's the resilience that is a very important new type of indicator about how we can not just respond to change, but potentially anticipate it and maybe reorganize ourselves in new ways. And that kind of reorganization, transformational component of water security, I think is probably the newest and least familiar and most aspirational part in how we're thinking about water now.
Looking for the predictable with the inevitable unpredictable coming up. But it's interesting how you phrase it. It goes way beyond now the traditional sense of the water sector, the water utility, the water supply. Great stuff. Martina, let's bring you in from Sweden. Welcome. And obviously in your role as advisor, Water and Peace at the Stockholm International Water Institute, how are you seeing this definition perhaps change, and can you link to what John was saying?
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here, and it's a great pleasure. And I would say that if we look at the more generally accepted definition of water security, then we look at access to adequate quantities and also quality of water for sustaining livelihoods, human well-being, and socioeconomic development, ensuring protection against waterborne diseases, and preventing ecosystems in a climate of peace and political stability. That's the usual definition that we usually work with. But when we really think about it, we need to maybe move away from, as John said, thinking about strictly water security in the water context, and really start talking about water and security, really helping us to better understand the impacts of water scarcity, or we often talk about either water we have too little, we have too much, also we can have some hazard events, or we have too dirty water. And we have to better understand what is the impact of this on human security, and how these events drive impacting national and regional security. And to really understand these interlinkages, we need to work better with other sectors. And that is really the key of the new era. And I think that one of the best examples, we often focus so much of that changing climate and water scarcity is a really threat multiplier, but we also can think about it as opportunities for more cooperation. And one of these examples is, for example, the new trilateral deal between Israel, Jordan, and the United Arab Emirates, which enables Jordan to provide solar energy to Israel in exchange for desalinated water supported by United Arab Emirates. And this agreement is really a model of future regional cooperation to build sustainable energy and water systems in a climate stress region. So this is something that we really do need to think when we think about the new definition. How are we linking it to other sectors? And we also need to be more context specific. We need to be more regional specific. We need to really think of the different indicators and drivers of instability. And we as the water community need to continuously trying to work better with other sectors, including the security sector, including economic sector, including other sectors. We need to be better in water efficiency. And lastly, we also need to be better in the way how we communicate about this uncertainty. We need to be better how we educate people about water conservancy, and how we also combat the spread of disinformation about water scarcity and water and insecurity.
Thank you, Martina. So it seems we need, it's encouraging to see that the definition continues to change, arguably, when the water that's being provided is in a changing environment. But from looking at your previous material, you speak a lot about water diplomacy and actually the link between water, peace, and security. So great to hear. Thank you. So David, let's bring you in on this in terms of water security. You have a military background from Australia. You look at this from a slightly different angle, but how do you see this definition and arguably how it's evolving and changing given the recent threats?
I agree with Martina that traditionally we've looked at water security in terms of access, that is, supply of sufficient quantity and quality of water. Increasingly in the hard security world, we're looking at water systems as well, infrastructure, whether it be canals, pipelines, treatment plants, and so on. And we also look at water data. So security of data around water is actually a critically important angle, not only democratizing that data so people understand what the water status is, but protecting it from cyber attacks or other disruptions. So even the traditional definition needs expanding a little bit. But in terms of thinking about it as a hard security issue, I don't think you can do better than to point to the work that the Pacific Institute has done. They run the water conflict chronology, which goes back about 5,000 years and tracks every instance of known water conflict. And they talk about water as a trigger for conflict, as a weapon within conflict, and also as a victim or a casualty of conflict. And the way that I would characterize that is actually to add two more categories. You can also think about water as a predictor of conflict. Some of the work that we've done in Syria and Iraq, and indeed during the Arab Spring, indicates that water shortage is actually one of the strongest predictors of unrest in an urban setting, and indeed of intra-state conflict in particularly water scarce areas of the world. So there's a strong connection between a water scarcity now, or an imbalance of control over water resources now, and the prediction of future conflict. And then finally, it's very much a legacy of conflict that we see long-standing disruption to aquifers, to surface water, to water systems, and then that can have a long-term legacy of harm to civilian populations even after an active conflict ends.
Interesting. Thank you, David. It's I think the theme that links all three answers is that basically water security is now going way beyond traditional sense of water provision, water quantity, and water quality. But interesting that you mentioned as a sort of predictor as well, looking at the data on water availability and then looking into the future where potential conflicts may happen, when water scarcity happens. So thank you. Well, Martina, then to kind of follow on from David's comments then, when you sort of look at water and peace in the world, do you see an acceleration of conflicts, or on the contrary, a greater number of resolved conflicts? Because maybe you can tap into the work you've been doing on water diplomacy, if you can.
Thank you for the question. I think here we really need to ask ourselves first, what is a conflict? Because in this terminology, often we do not distinguish between armed conflict and between political tensions. And this is for conflict scientists, it's a very important distinction. And so I would say that, I still would say that we will not see armed wars, interstate wars over water, if that is the only source of incompatibility. If there is no any other type of tension, it's very unlikely that states would go into a war just for incompatibility or disagreement over management of a shared water resource. What we need to do is we need to really think about the different levels of conflicts and different scales. So here we can think about the escalations at community levels that we see much more, and that really we see one of the examples is the conflicts between the pastoral communities in Eastern Africa, where over a scarce resource. And then we have to really track and ask ourselves how these local escalations on community level, does this impact regional dynamics? Does this impact intrastate conflicts? This is often used by non-state armed actors who take advantage of vulnerable communities who are vulnerable because of these increasing scarcities. And that really then feeds into other types of conflicts based on grievances. So I think that here it's really important to distinguish between this. And on a more intrastate level, then it's important to also think that these growing problems and uncertainties, it also, what we see from our work, it often also actually creates an opportunity for cooperation. Many countries do know that the future is both very unpredictable, but also that they would only gain from cooperation. So what we see is we see new forms of dialogues, we see new forms of agreement that are, for example, looking into opportunities to work with renewable energy, to look into something to see how we can take advantage, for example, from something called virtual water. Can we, for example, optimize use that we have agreements about growing certain crops in one part of the basin, which is more water rich, and then have different benefit sharing mechanisms. So often we don't talk so much about these dialogues and opportunities for cooperation because it's not very newsworthy. I think it's not considered as interesting news that there was some meeting between some countries. But then, of course, the headlines about possible water wars, that's something very interesting. So I think for this, if I were to summarize, it's to really think about first, what do we mean by conflict? Second, to really look at different levels. And I think then the danger is really to think about the vulnerable communities. One whole different dimension is also that water scarcity also drives gender-based violence. We see in different parts of the world, that women who are responsible for collecting water have to walk longer distances, and that exposes them for different types of risks. And really to really think about this when we think about security, to think about these different parts of aspects is important. But
yeah. Very good. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, conflict by its nature is a very emotive word, but actually within that, what definition are we looking at? There's disagreements about water all the time. Whether it leads to armed conflict is another matter. But on that note then, David, I think it's very difficult to have this conversation around water security in an uncertain world without bringing in the topical news of the current conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And you actually have some kind of evidence of where water as a strategic asset was affected within the early days of the conflict. So we don't want to completely dominate the conversation on Ukraine here, but just to give an example and a topical data point, it'd be good to bring that in.
I think that Ukraine is interesting primarily because it's an example of broader patterns that we see. And just to agree with Martina, we haven't actually seen examples of water alone driving conflict, but we do frequently see water as a major driver of interstate tension. And we actually see water having a significant impact on how a conflict plays out once it starts. Just to go back to the point about whether conflicts over water are getting more common, just looking at violent conflicts and using that water conflict chronology that I referred to earlier as a baseline, about 650 conflicts in the decade before 2020, about 220 in just the 3 years since the turn of this decade. So significant increase in the number of armed conflicts over water that are happening globally. And Ukraine is obviously one of those. One of the other interesting things about Ukraine, and we see this in other examples too, like in Sri Lanka, in Syria and so on, is that it isn't solely access to drinking water that people try to weaponize. It's actually mostly access to agricultural irrigation water. So the Crimean Peninsula in particular was traditionally a bit of an agricultural desert, and under the Soviet Union, the North Crimean Canal was constructed to bring water down to the peninsula, and it became a very important source of agricultural water for Crimea. When Russia seized the peninsula in 2014, the Ukrainians built a dam across the North Crimean Canal to hold that water back, and that had a massive impact on agriculture in Russian-controlled Crimea, reduced it by about 85%. So unsurprisingly, almost the very first thing that the Russians did at the beginning of the conflict was to blow up that dam, thereby restoring water flow back to the Crimean Peninsula. Another thing they did was to target the Kiev Dam, which is north of the capital city of Ukraine, which if they'd succeeded in doing that, would have potentially flooded hundreds of thousands of people out of their homes and possibly killed many thousands of people at the beginning of the conflict. The Ukrainians successfully disrupted that strike, but then Ukraine itself used strategic flooding as a way to channel the Russian attack into Kyiv. So we see, I think, water as one component of drivers of conflict. We see it as a shaper of how conflict takes place. And in the Ukrainian example, we can see both sides using water as a weapon, and in particular, access to agricultural water as a key driver of how that conflict is playing out.
Interesting on the agricultural kind of access to water and the strategy behind that. But let's go from perhaps conflict to back to cooperation. It's a word you mentioned, Martina, and I want to kind of throw to you, John, because from looking at your previous interviews, you're a big phrase of positioning water as a connector and being cross-cutting. And I like from your previous stuff, you always seem quite optimistic about this as a role of water to connect, perhaps in an ever more fragmented world affected by climate change. So how do you see this playing out in terms of water as a connector when it comes to being the cornerstone of water security?
Well, I appreciate that. I mean, I actually would like to say that in many of the ideas, the implications of Martina and David embedded this concept of water as a connector. Actually, by looking at some of those causes of conflict, we can actually transform it. We can shift it over to the other side and say, well, are there things that, is there a program of action there? And I think that there very much is, that we can talk about, for instance, in the case of climate change, the traditional way that we frame climate change and water is really as a threat multiplier, that it makes other problems much worse because of increased variability or changes in quality or quantity in the water cycle because of climate change. I actually I think that the other part of that is that water is maybe quite profoundly a resilience multiplier as well. And this new way of thinking about our governance systems, our infrastructure systems, even the linkages between our economies and ecosystems, through the lens of water as this resilience multiplier, as a resilience connector, is quite profound. And it also, in practical terms, as a water scientist, as a climate scientist, one of the big changes that I've made personally is I talk much less about basins, about hydrology than I used to. And that's simply because the water moves and is expressed so profoundly through institutions, through administrative relationships, through products and services. Very quick example, the chips shortage that we have faced during the COVID period with semiconductors is a great, I think, exemplar to show the weaknesses of trying to focus on hydrological basins as our sort of unit of problem, unit of management, that we have to think about supply chains. That was really a drought shortage, a water shortage in Taiwan that multiplied across the global economy. And so if you're in Silicon Valley, you're in Cape Town, you're in Shanghai, you're trying to manage your own supply chain, you don't have access to chips. That really is a water problem embedded in your supply chain that you haven't been anticipating, that you haven't been preparing for, that you are not resilient for. So my definition of water conflict may be a little more passive aggressive than expressed by David and Martina, but I think it at least comes into the accelerant side or decelerant component of the decisions that we're making.
Great. Thank you, John. Yeah, I think the computer chips, the microchips, is a great example, actually, because you think the water's supplied locally, but actually the impact has been on a global level, way beyond Taiwan, right? So great stuff. So finally, Martina, you, talk a lot about kind of the multi-stakeholder approach. And I'd love to just get, maybe coming back to the first sort of question, is really, when you, of all the different nations you work with and look at, who's doing it right? I mean, when it comes to looking ahead to this uncertain, unpredictable world, having that multi-stakeholder approach, policymakers, financiers, the public, who do you think, who do you put up there and think, actually, when it comes to water security, these guys are the champions? They're really they're looking ahead, and they're going with this multi-stakeholder approach. Who springs to mind, Martina, for you?
I think it's difficult to name organizations. I would not want to, of course. I can say that we at CV, Stockholm International Organizations, are trying to do our best. But then there are also many other organizations who really try to bring together the right actors. And it's so conflict specific. You really need to know who is the key player in different regions, and you really need to engage them. One other importance is we really need to be very inclusive. We need to engage representatives of different vulnerable groups. We also need to be gender inclusive. It's important to have inclusivity when we negotiate about water, to really have all broad perspectives represented. It's very difficult to really say who does it the best, but I think that if we work together, we can all strive to achieve our best while working together. So I think that's what I would like to say. And maybe one last moment, it should be mentioned that the previous administration in Afghanistan, they had a very, very good mechanism how the different sectors in Afghanistan work together. It was something that in our trainings, we actually used that as an example. So this is something one would maybe not think that the country that had such an unfortunate fate actually was, I would say they were champions on this issue.
Very good. Thank you, Martina. So, David, whilst Martina does have a great point, it's very difficult to pick a single institution, but in terms of at a country level, where do you see in terms of conversations you're having of nations that are doing it right?
Well, actually, Martina's mentioned the example that I was going to bring up, which is Afghanistan, and it was a very good model of inclusive stakeholder engagement. And I'll just observe with my anthropological background that in many societies worldwide, water issues generally are the province of women. And one of the problems that's happened in a lot of places is that when you talk hard security, it tends to be male dominated in the discussion. And you often don't have the data you need to resolve problems if it's all a bunch of men talking to each other that aren't aware of the real status of what's going on with water access, water quality, water systems in a society. Afghanistan actually made great strides before we abandoned them to make significant improvements there, and we're really a key model. The other place I'd point to, again, Martina mentioned already, is the cooperation we're seeing in the Middle East now between multiple different countries that have a history of conflict, looking at water as a shared resource. And I think that's a very important place to look if you want to look at where some of the best practices are that are emerging.
And you're not allowed to say Afghanistan. You have to pick somewhere else. just keep another answer. But perhaps there's any examples where there's multinational agreements around water and security where you look at it as a positive example.
Sure. I'll speak at three levels. I think that the kind of general trend is that we're seeing the kind of vanguard of institutions at maybe at a city level, an urban landscape level, to countries, and in a few cases regions that are becoming comfortable with discomfort. Essentially, that they're thinking about insecurity as a permanent state that they need to be ready for, that they need to be prepared for, and that water is the primary medium both of those negative impacts and the medium of resilience. I'd say at a regional level, that you see places like Latin America that are very far advanced in this thinking. And frankly, I think a part of it goes back to quite old governance structures and how they view water as a public good across that region. But there's some standouts, standouts that are as different as Costa Rica and Bolivia. Both are countries that have done, I think, quite remarkable advanced work in being able to see water across the spectrum of building both economic and ecological and social resilience within those countries. But you're starting to see it in other regions too that have different governance traditions. I think countries like Malawi, again, following Martina, some of these examples are maybe a little surprising. I think Malawi's actually made very significant strides. South Africa is an early leader in this space, even before the Day Zero issues, and continues, I think, to be a regional standout for Africa and for middle-income countries generally. And then I think places like Indonesia have also taken a kind of whole-of-government approach to water security as essential, the kind of first SDG that serves as a platform for other goals and long-term resilience in general.
Great stuff. Thank you, John. Well, I think it's encouraging, as you mentioned, perhaps the surprising heroes in the story, and actually Malawi, Afghanistan, Bolivia. Martina, you mentioned the collaboration in the Middle East as well, and David, as you referenced, perhaps nations that have historically had political conflict. So that's really encouraging to hear. But I think perhaps the phrases to pull out of this is that actually to end on an optimistic note, that water can be seen as, to steal your phrase, John, a resilience multiplier, which I really like. We often hear about the word resilience, but actually how water can drive that between multiple stakeholders and agencies is a great way to position this. So we are at the end of that 30-minute Q Talk. So I really want to thank our top-level speakers, John, Martina, and David, for your expertise. We encourage everyone to tune in for the next one, which is going to be focused on net zero and the role of water utilities in reaching that by 2030. And by all means, please share and stay tuned on future Q Talk developments. Thanks for your time.